Minnesota Territory, January 1856. The knock came at midnight, when the temperature outside had dropped to 40 below zero, and the wind was howling like something alive and hungry. Samuel Arden opened the door of the boarding house to find his landlord standing in the hallway, breath fogging an air so cold that it crept inside despite the building's thick walls. Behind Samuel, his 7-year-old son Daniel sat up in bed, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You need to leave," the landlord said. His name was Hendricks, a thin man with thin lips and a heart to match. "Tonight." "Tonight? It's 40 below out there. My son—" "Your son is why you're leaving. Mrs. Patterson complained. Says she can't sleep with a child running around above her room. Says it's not what she paid for." "Daniel doesn't run. He barely makes a sound. He knows to be quiet." "I don't care what he does or doesn't do. Mrs. Patterson pays double what you pay, and she wants you gone. So you're gone." Hendricks thrust a small cloth bag toward Samuel. "Here's your deposit back, minus the cleaning fee." Samuel stared at the bag, knowing without counting that it contained perhaps $2. Enough for a meal, maybe two, but not enough for another room anywhere in town. Not in January, when every boarding house was full of people fleeing the killing cold. "Where are we supposed to go?" "That's not my concern. You've got 1 hour to clear out." The door closed. Samuel stood in the darkness, listening to Hendricks's footsteps retreating down the stairs, feeling the cold already seeping through the thin walls of the room that was no longer his. Behind him, Daniel's voice came small and frightened. "Papa? What's happening?" Samuel turned to face his son, the boy who had lost his mother to fever 2 years ago, who had followed his father from job to job across 3 territories, who had learned to be silent and invisible, because that was what survival required. "We're going on an adventure," Samuel said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Get dressed, son. Wear everything warm you have." They walked out into the killing cold at 1 in the morning, carrying everything they owned in 2 canvas bags. The town of Stillwater was silent, its streets empty of anyone fool enough to be outside in weather that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Samuel kept Daniel close, wrapping his arm around the boy's thin shoulders, moving as quickly as he dared toward... where? There was nowhere to go. The other boarding houses would be full, and even if they weren't, Samuel's $2 wouldn't cover more than a night or two. The churches were locked until morning. The jail might take them in, but Samuel had seen what happened to children who entered the system, separated from parents, sent to workhouses, forgotten. He would die before he let that happen to Daniel. They walked north, away from town, because north was the direction Samuel's feet chose, and he had no better plan. The cold bit through their coats, through their layers of clothing, through everything they had. Daniel didn't complain. He never complained. But Samuel could feel him shivering against his side. "Just a little farther," Samuel said, not knowing if it was true. "There's shelter ahead." There had to be shelter ahead. There had to be something. The bluffs rose to their left, limestone cliffs that lined the St. Croix River Valley, carved by ancient waters into shapes that looked almost deliberate in the moonlight. Samuel had worked in these bluffs the previous summer, cutting timber for a logging company that had paid poorly and fired him when the season ended. He knew them better than most, knew the caves and overhangs that dotted the cliff faces, knew the places where the rock formed natural shelters. One cave in particular. He had eaten lunch there on hot summer days, enjoying the cool air that flowed from its depths. The loggers had called it worthless, too small to store equipment, too remote to be useful. But Samuel remembered how warm that air had felt compared to the summer heat outside. If it was cool in summer, it might be warm in winter. He angled toward the bluffs, half carrying Daniel now, the boy's strength fading as the cold sapped everything from him. The cave entrance was perhaps a mile ahead, up a slope that would be treacherous in this weather. But treacherous was better than certain death. "Almost there," Samuel gasped, his lungs burning with cold. "Almost there, Daniel. Stay with me." The boy didn't answer. His eyes were closed, his breath shallow. Samuel lifted him fully, cradling his son against his chest, and began to climb. The cave saved their lives that night. Samuel stumbled through the entrance just as his own strength gave out, collapsing onto stone that was cold but not killing cold, in air that was perhaps 40 degrees, 80 degrees warmer than the nightmare outside. He lay there for long minutes, holding Daniel against him, feeling the cave's warmth slowly penetrate their frozen bodies. Daniel stirred first. "Papa, where are we?" "Somewhere safe," Samuel said. "Somewhere warm." "It doesn't feel warm." "It's warmer than outside. That's what matters right now." They huddled together through the rest of the night, sharing body heat in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside the cave entrance like a beast cheated of its prey. When dawn finally came, Samuel explored their refuge by the gray light filtering in from outside. The cave was larger than he remembered, a main chamber perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand. The floor was relatively flat, covered with sand and dried leaves that had blown in over countless seasons. A smaller passage led deeper into the bluff, and from this passage came a steady flow of air that was warmer than the main chamber. Samuel followed the passage for perhaps 50 feet before it narrowed too much to continue. But he had learned what he needed to know. The cave breathed, warm air flowing out through the main entrance, replaced by more warm air from somewhere deep in the earth. The temperature in the main chamber was perhaps 50 degrees, comfortable enough to survive without fire, comfortable enough to live. "Daniel," he called back toward the main chamber. "I think we found our new home." The first week was about immediate survival, staying warm, finding food, keeping Daniel safe while Samuel figured out what came next. He ventured into town once, on a day when the temperature had risen to merely 20 below zero, and traded labor for supplies at a general store whose owner remembered him from the logging days. Flour, salt, dried beans, a pot to cook in, candles for light. Not much, but enough. "Heard Hendricks threw you out," the store owner said. His name was Garrison, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a practical mind. "In that weather, with a boy, man ought to be ashamed." "Shame's not something Hendricks feels," Samuel replied. "But we're managing." "Where are you staying? Not outside, I hope." Samuel hesitated. The cave was his secret, his safety. If word spread that he was living in a cave with a child, someone might decide he was unfit as a father. Someone might try to take Daniel away. "We've got shelter," he said carefully. "It's rough, but it's warm enough." Garrison studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you need work, come spring, I could use help around the store. Nothing fancy, but it's steady." "I appreciate that. I'll remember." He returned to the cave with his supplies, already planning the improvements that would transform a natural shelter into an actual home. The cabin inside the cave took shape over the following weeks, built from materials that Samuel gathered, scavenged, and occasionally purchased with the small amounts of money he earned from odd jobs in town. The basic structure was simple: a wooden frame set against the cave's back wall, where the warm air emerged from the deeper passages. The frame supported walls of woven branches sealed with clay that Samuel dug from the riverbank, creating an insulated shell within the already insulated cave. A simple door of rough planks kept the warmth in and any curious animals out. Daniel helped with everything his 7-year-old hands could manage. He gathered branches and stripped bark for weaving. He carried clay in buckets from the river. He held boards steady while his father hammered them into place. The work gave him purpose, and purpose kept the fear at bay.
"Papa, why is the cave warm?"
Daniel asked one evening as they sat inside their half-finished cabin, eating beans cooked over a small fire at the cave entrance. "It's cold everywhere else." Samuel considered how to explain it simply. "The earth is warm, deep down. Not hot like fire, but warm like a blanket. This cave goes deep into the earth, so the warmth comes up through it." "Like the earth is breathing?" "Exactly like that. The earth breathes warm air, and we get to share it." Daniel thought about this. "So the earth is taking care of us?" "I suppose it is, in a way. We just had to find the right place to let it." The cabin was finished by the end of February. A single room, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a sleeping platform for Daniel, a cot for Samuel, a small table, and shelves for their meager possessions. It wasn't much by any standard, but it was theirs. No landlord could throw them out. No one could take it away. Samuel had learned to love the work of building, something he'd never had the chance to explore while laboring for others. Each joint he fitted, each board he shaped, each improvement he made to their shelter, all of it was his, created by his own hands for his own family. The satisfaction was unlike anything he'd experienced in years of working for wages that barely covered survival. He added small touches that made the space feel like home. A window cut into the cabin wall, covered with oiled paper that let in light from the cave entrance during the day. Pegs for hanging clothes and tools. A small shelf beside Daniel's bed, where the boy kept his few treasures. A carved wooden horse that had belonged to his mother. A collection of interesting stones gathered from the cave floor. A book of fairy tales that Garrison had given him. The routine they developed was simple but satisfying. Mornings began with breakfast cooked over a small fire at the cave entrance, where the smoke could escape without filling their living space. Samuel would work whatever odd jobs he could find in town, while Daniel explored the cave or practiced the reading and arithmetic his father taught him each evening. Dinner was eaten together, followed by stories or quiet conversation before sleep. "It's like a secret castle," Daniel said on the first night they slept in the completed cabin. "Hidden in a magic mountain." "That's exactly what it is," Samuel agreed. "And we're the only ones who know about it." But that wasn't true for long. The great blizzard arrived on March 3rd, 3 days after Samuel and Daniel had settled into their cave cabin. The storm had been building for days, pressure dropping, temperature swinging wildly, old-timers in town muttering about signs and portents that city folk couldn't read. Samuel had felt it coming in his bones, the way people who work outdoors learn to feel weather before it arrives. He had spent the 2 days before the storm gathering extra firewood, stockpiling food, preparing for something bad. What arrived was worse than bad. It was apocalyptic. The wind reached speeds that no one in Minnesota had ever recorded, driving snow horizontally with enough force to blind anyone foolish enough to be outside. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero. Visibility fell to zero. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, couldn't tell which direction was which, couldn't do anything except huddle and pray. Samuel and Daniel huddled in their cave cabin, warm and safe, while the world outside went mad. The cave entrance became a howling tunnel of wind and snow, but the cabin's position deep within the main chamber protected them from the worst of it. The earth's warmth continued to flow, maintaining a temperature that was uncomfortable but survivable. On the second night of the storm, someone found them. Samuel heard it first, a sound that didn't fit with the storm's constant roar. A cry, maybe, or a call. He told Daniel to stay in the cabin and ventured toward the cave entrance, holding a lantern against the darkness. A figure stumbled through the entrance, coated in ice, barely recognizable as human. Behind it came another figure, then another. They collapsed on the cave floor, gasping, shaking, more dead than alive. "Help," one of them managed to say. "Please, our wagon. Lost." Samuel didn't hesitate. He dragged the first figure deeper into the cave, toward the warmth of the cabin. Daniel appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. "Get blankets," Samuel ordered. "All of them, and heat water." The boy ran to obey, while Samuel returned to the entrance. More figures were stumbling in now. A family, he realized, parents and children who had been caught on the road when the storm hit. Their wagon had overturned somewhere outside. They had seen the faint glow of Samuel's lantern through the blowing snow, and had followed it like a beacon. 7 people that first night. A father, a mother, 5 children ranging from perhaps 4 to 14 years old. They crowded into Samuel's tiny cabin, warming themselves by the small stove, drinking hot water because there wasn't enough food for actual meals. "You saved our lives," the father said. His name was Thomas Lindqvist, a Swedish immigrant heading west with his family. "We would have died out there. The children." "Anyone would have done the same," Samuel said. "No, not anyone. Many would have turned us away, protected what they had. You didn't." Samuel glanced at Daniel, who had given up his sleeping platform for the younger Lindqvist children and was sitting against the wall with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The boy caught his eye and smiled, a small, tired smile that contained more pride than Samuel had seen from him in months. "We have room," Samuel said. "As long as the storm lasts, you have room." The storm lasted 5 more days, and more people found the cave. Word spread somehow, perhaps through the howling wind itself, perhaps through some instinct that drove desperate people toward shelter. A logging crew of 4 men arrived on the 3rd day, their camp destroyed by the wind. A trapper came on the 4th day, half frozen and delirious. 2 more families stumbled in on the 5th day, bringing the total to 23 souls crowded into a cave that had seemed spacious when it held only 2. Samuel organized them with the efficiency of a man who had spent years taking orders and now found himself giving them. The cave became a community, each person contributing what they could. The Lindqvist mother, Maria, took charge of rationing the food supplies, stretching what little they had across too many mouths. She had a gift for making much from little, turning scraps and foraged roots into soups that warmed both body and spirit. The logging crew gathered firewood from the cave entrance area, venturing out in brief shifts when the wind occasionally lessened. They were rough men, hard men, but they took turns watching over the smaller children so the mothers could rest. The trapper, whose name was Henderson, recovered enough to contribute his skills. He set snares near the cave entrance during lulls in the storm, catching rabbits that added precious protein to their meals. He also knew how to read the weather, and his predictions about how long the storm would last proved remarkably accurate. The older children watched the younger ones, keeping them calm and occupied while adults worried. They invented games that could be played in the cramped space, told stories to pass the time, created a world of imagination that held fear at bay. Daniel proved invaluable. He knew the cave better than anyone except his father, knew the warm spots and the cold spots, knew where to find water dripping from the rocks, knew how to navigate in the darkness when candles ran low. He led the other children on expeditions to explore the safer passages, turning fear into adventure. "Your boy's something special," Thomas Lindqvist told Samuel one evening. They were standing near the cave entrance, watching the storm that showed no signs of ending. Most children his age would be terrified. He's leading expeditions. He's had to grow up fast, Samuel said. We both have. What happened, if you don't mind my asking? A man doesn't end up living in a cave with his son without a story behind it. Samuel told him about his wife's death, about the jobs that never lasted, about Hendrix and the midnight eviction that had driven them into the cold. Lindqvist listened without interrupting, his face growing darker as the story progressed. This landlord, Lindqvist said when Samuel finished, this Hendrix, he threw you out at 40 below zero because a woman complained about footsteps. That's about the size of it. And you found this cave and built all of this? He gestured at the cabin, the organized chaos of 23 people surviving together. I built shelter for my son. Everything else just happened. No. Lindqvist shook his head firmly. Everything else happened because you were here. Because you built something. Because when we stumbled out of that storm, there was a light to follow and warmth to find. You saved 20 lives, Samuel. Maybe more before this is over. Samuel didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought of himself as someone who saved lives. He was just a man trying to keep his son alive, one day at a time.
Papa!
Daniel appeared at his elbow, tugging at his sleeve.
Mrs. Lindqvist says dinner is ready. She made soup from the rabbit Mr. Henderson caught.
Then we'd better eat while it's hot. They walked back into the cave together, father and son, joining a community that had formed from desperation and was becoming something more. The storm broke on March 8th, the sun emerging into a world buried under snow. The refugees emerged from the cave blinking in the brilliant light, marveling at the drifts that reached 20 feet high in places, at the trees bent and broken by wind that had exceeded anything in living memory. The landscape was unrecognizable, transformed into something alien and beautiful and terrible. 20 people had survived in a cave because a single father had been thrown out of a boarding house and had refused to let his son die. The news spread quickly once the roads became passable. A reporter from the St. Paul newspaper made the difficult journey to see the cave for himself, and the story he wrote captured the imagination of readers across the territory. Cave of Refuge, the headline read. Father and son sheltered 20 souls from death. The article described Samuel's eviction, his desperate flight into the cold, his discovery of the cave and construction of the cabin within it. It described the families who had found their way to safety, the children who had survived, the community that had formed in the darkness underground. It made Samuel Arden famous, which was the last thing he wanted. They want to interview you, Garrison told him when Samuel came to town for supplies. Newspapers from Chicago, from New York even. They want to write about the man who saved 20 lives. I didn't save anyone. The cave saved them. I just happened to be in it. That's not how they see it. That's not how anyone sees it. Garrison leaned forward across his counter. You could use this, Samuel. The attention, the goodwill. People want to help you. Let them. Samuel thought about Daniel, about the life he wanted for his son, a life of stability, of opportunity, of something better than caves and boarding houses and constant uncertainty. What kind of help? He asked. The help came in forms that Samuel hadn't imagined. A businessman from St. Paul offered him a job managing a warehouse, with a salary that would support a family and a small house included. A church group raised money to help the storm refugees get back on their feet, and Samuel received a share despite his protests. The Lindqvist family once they had recovered from their ordeal, insisted on helping Samuel expand the cave cabin into something more permanent.
"You gave us shelter when we had nothing,"
Thomas Lindqvist said.
"Now we give back. That's how it works."
By summer, the cave had been transformed. The original cabin remained, but additional structures had been built. A larger common room, storage areas, even a small stable near the entrance for the horse that Samuel had been able to purchase with his warehouse salary. The cave had become a homestead, a place that could shelter travelers caught in storms or provide overflow housing when the town's accommodations filled. Samuel found that he had a gift for hospitality, for making strangers feel welcome in an unusual space. Travelers who stopped at the cave homestead often stayed longer than intended, drawn by the warmth, both physical and emotional, that Samuel and Daniel had created. Word spread along the frontier roads that there was a cave near Stillwater, where a kind man and his son would offer shelter to anyone in need. The warehouse job proved satisfying in ways that previous employment hadn't. Samuel's employer, a German immigrant named Weber, treated his workers fairly and valued reliability over flashiness. For the first time in years, Samuel had steady income, regular hours, and the respect of an employer who saw him as a person rather than a replaceable tool. He used some of his earnings to improve the cave homestead further. A proper door replaced the rough planks of the original cabin. Glass windows replaced oiled paper. A cast iron stove, hauled up from town with considerable difficulty, made heating more efficient and cooking more pleasant. Each improvement was a small victory, a step toward the stability that had always eluded him. Daniel thrived in the new circumstances. He attended school in town, made friends among the children he had helped save during the blizzard, began to lose the wariness that had marked his face since his mother's death. He still loved the cave, still explored its depths on weekends and holidays, but now it was adventure rather than necessity. The boy had changed in ways that went beyond simple health and happiness. He had developed a confidence that came from having contributed something meaningful during the crisis. The other children looked up to him as the one who knew the cave, who had led them through the darkness, who had helped his father save their lives. It was a foundation of self-worth that no amount of money could have purchased. Samuel watched his son's transformation with a mixture of pride and relief. The years of uncertainty, of constantly moving, of never knowing where the next meal would come from. Those years had taken a toll on Daniel that Samuel had feared might be permanent. But children were resilient in ways that adults often forgot. Given stability and love, they could heal from almost anything. Their relationship deepened during the months following the blizzard. They had always been close. A single father and his only child could hardly be otherwise. But now there was a new dimension to their bond. They were partners, collaborators, two people who had built something together and continued building every day. Samuel taught Daniel practical skills, how to read weather signs, how to maintain tools, how to judge the character of strangers. Daniel taught Samuel things too, though the lessons were less obvious. How to find joy in small moments, how to forgive without forgetting, how to look forward instead of backward.
"Papa,"
He said one autumn evening, sitting on the rocks outside the cave entrance and watching the sun set over the river valley.
"Do you think Mama knows what we built here?"
Samuel sat beside his son, feeling the peace that had gradually replaced the constant anxiety of their earlier years. "I think she knows. I think she's proud of both of us."
"I'm glad Mr. Hendricks threw us out."
Samuel laughed, surprised. "You're glad?"
"If he hadn't thrown us out, we wouldn't have found the cave, and all those people wouldn't have had anywhere to go during the storm. So really, he did a good thing without meaning to."
That's one way to look at it.
"It's the right way. You always say to look for the good in things, even bad things. Getting thrown out was bad, but what came after was good. Samuel put his arm around his son, pulling him close. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from watching you, Papa." Samuel Arden lived in the cave homestead until 1891,
when age and declining health made the climb too difficult. He moved to a small house in town, but Daniel, now grown with a family of his own, maintained the cave as a refuge for travelers, a tradition that continued until the 1920s. The homestead became something of a landmark in the region, known to travelers and locals alike as a place where hospitality was guaranteed and the unusual setting made for memorable stories. 3 generations of the Arden family maintained the tradition that Samuel had started, welcoming strangers and offering shelter without asking for payment beyond what guests chose to give. The cave itself remained unchanged by the decades, its constant temperature and gentle airflow continuing regardless of what happened in the human world above. Visitors often remarked on the sense of timelessness inside, the feeling that they had stepped out of the rushing current of modern life into something older and more stable. The Great Blizzard of 1856 remained the worst storm in Minnesota's recorded history until the Armistice Day blizzard of 1940. Official records documented 140 deaths across the territory, most from exposure and freezing. 23 people survived because they found a cave where a desperate father had built a cabin to save his son. The stories of that survival passed down through families for generations. The Lindqvist descendants, numbering in the hundreds by the time of the 21st century, held reunions every decade at the state park that now protected the cave. They called themselves cave cousins and told their children about the storm, about the strange, warm cave, about the man and his son who had given them shelter when death waited outside. Daniel Arden became a surveyor, then a civil engineer, eventually helping to design some of Minnesota's first modern storm shelters. He credited his childhood in the cave with teaching him the principles of natural insulation and thermal regulation that informed his professional work. "My father built our first shelter with nothing but determination and an understanding of how the earth works," Daniel wrote in a professional journal in 1902. "Everything I've accomplished since is built on that foundation." The cave still exists today, protected as part of a state park that bears Samuel's name. Visitors can tour the main chamber, can see the reconstructed cabin that occupies the same spot where the original stood. Interpretive signs tell the story of the blizzard, the refugees, the single father who turned a desperate survival situation into something that saved lives. Samuel's grave overlooks the river valley he came to love, a simple stone bearing a simple inscription. He found warmth in the cold. He found family in strangers. He found home in a hole in the rock. The January night when Hendricks knocked on his door and threw him into 40 below weather was supposed to be the end of Samuel Arden's story. Instead, it became the beginning. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just doorways to something better. Sometimes being thrown out is the first step toward finding where you truly belong. Samuel Arden was cast out with nothing but his son. He built a home in a cave, and when the worst storm in history arrived, he had shelter enough for 20 souls who would otherwise have died in the cold. His family gave him nothing. He gave himself everything. And then he gave it away to strangers who needed it more.